Photography 1, Lecture 4, Color. This image is by William Eggleston, and it was part of a group of photographs that he called William Eggleston's Guide. It was part of a landmark exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art. At the time, which was 1973, no photographer working in color had ever been given a one-person show at any major museum or gallery anywhere in the world. It was just considered, color was considered crass and cheap and not fit for artists to work with. Clearly that's all changed, but at the time it was something of a revolution. This image is rather complex. It's relatively straightforward in its structure, but with this outfit that she's wearing that clashes so powerfully against the cushion on which she's sitting, it becomes a much more complicated proposition, and one that is very much part of Eggleston's mode of working. The next person to get a one-person show at the Museum of Modern Art was Stephen Shore, and his exhibition followed very closely on the heels of Eggleston's, I believe within the same year, where Eggleston primarily shot with a 35mm camera, a Leica. Shore preferred large cameras. This particular image was made with an 8x10, as were most of the images in that first exhibition of his. He was drawn to subjects that were very reminiscent of Walker Evans, and also his way of dealing with them was very similar to Evans's work. Architecture usually plays a part in his work, and there's a sensitivity to the buildings and the place where they're taken that is consistent from one to the next. Here we see a movie marquee at sunset or a little after, and the moon is rising in the background. But that marquee really pops in relation to the more subdued colors of the fronts of the building it's attached to, and the cars, and even the people down below. The first color photograph was actually made in 1861, not very long after the invention of black and white photography. It used a 3-color process, and this image of a ribbon, a multicolored ribbon, was made by a Scottish scientist and a photographer that he was working with. For whatever reason, a viable commercial process by which color images could be made wouldn't come along for at least another 50 years. And that was in the form of the Autochrome. This was a French invention, and unique for its ability to create a very kind of soft, grainy image. Interestingly, the oldest known image made with the Autochrome process, this one, was made of soldiers in a trench. Not a particularly prosaic subject matter, but or poetic subject matter, I should say. But you know, a color image nonetheless, very muted tones and actually quite beautiful. This is also an Autochrome made by Heinrich Kuhn, who was a pictorialist photographer. His mode of working up until he started using color was very soft focus, kind of misty, romantic imagery, and this certainly fits into that category. And again, the Autochrome was perfect for his purposes because of its softness. This image by Russel Lee, who was one of the Farm Security Administration photographers working during the Depression in the 30s. This is a Kodachrome, which came into existence in the mid-30s. And it caught on very quickly with amateur photographers and some commercial photographers, but again, serious photographers were very leery of introducing color into their work. This shows a couple of migrant workers who were the subject matter of a great deal of what the Farm Security Administration would focus on at the time. This is by Paul Aerobridge, who was a commercial photographer but also had fine art leanings and actually created quite a bit of fine artwork. He was particularly interested in creating scenes like this. He used a process called a Carbro print to make his images. They are remarkably stable. The color doesn't shift if the prints are well taken care of. You can't leave them out in the sun, but that's true of virtually any color material, even black and white. But as a result, the ones that exist most of them are still in very good shape, despite having been made as much as 70 or 80 years ago. Elliot Porter was one of a number of photographers who were hired full-time by Arizona Highways, which was a magazine that existed to promote the beauty of Arizona. And while he would, most of the work that he did involved vistas of one kind or another, things that one would readily see if you were driving on the highways of Arizona, he also would be taken by sort of smaller moments like this one. Very subtle use of color and quite beautiful. As with most of the photographers of that kind of work, at this time he was photographing primarily with a view camera, very much as others have been. This is by Irving Penn, who was primarily a fashion photographer and also did product and celebrities. But he also was interested in examining objects very close. He did a series on flowers, and with a very simple setup. He photographed them in front of a white background, so there'd be virtually no background information to get in the way of the flower. They were very softly lit, so you could see detail everywhere. There's still enough contrast that you have a sense of three-dimensional modeling, but the lighting does not draw attention to itself. And in the case of this tulip, I guess it looked like it would be a good idea to wet it down, which was sort of the style at the time this was made in the late 60s, to give it a sort of glistening quality. This is another image by William Eggleston, and Eggleston traveled with his cameras everywhere. Again, Leicas, very small cameras, didn't make a lot of noise when you tripped the shutter. And virtually wherever he was on the lookout for potential images. In this case, the quality of light passing through this this drink on in a tray, excuse me, in an airliner, must have been irresistible, and has proved to be one of his more everlasting images. This one keeps coming up. And this is by Stephen Shore. This was also part of his first show at the Museum of Modern Art, and depicts Hollywood, the corner of Beverly and La Brea Avenues. And it shows Shore's proclivities, which were for the urban landscape, very much the built landscape. Joel Meyerowitz is a New York photographer, and in the early 1970s, he began going to Cape Cod during the summers, and he would bring his 8x10 Deerdorf camera and began recording sites that he would see up there, excuse me, in color using negative film, and from them he would make sea prints, most of which have this very kind of romantic quality. His other work is much more kinetic. He was at the time he was photographing in the streets and with a lot going on. And these images from his first book called Cape Light are very subdued, quiet, and but no less powerful. Steve McCurry is a photographer who has worked for the National Geographic, among other publications, but for Nat Geo primarily, and for which he's best known. And this is the best known of his images. This Afghan girl who he was introduced to, he was photographing. He photographs around the world, photographs a lot of people, and he would be introduced by local guides to people who were willing to have their photographs taken. And this woman with her green eyes, he just found too compelling and photographed her, and it became National Geographic's most popular cover photo, and which I think still stands today. It's a kind of an astonishing portrait, and I say that suggesting that you haven't seen it before, and I think most people have. It's an amazing image. This is by Len Geiger, a photographer who started working in color in the 1970s. He's spent a lot of time traveling across the country, recording whatever caught his eye, and apparently he was in a motel which had this particular scene in the lobby, and couldn't resist. I think what really caps it is being able to see out the window to the view. I believe this is in Montana. Here's another Andres Gorski, one of the series that he worked on in the late 1990s, early 2000s, was of spaces like this. This is the Chicago Board of Trade, various stock markets and gathering places of large gathering places. The various government bodies he was drawn to. This one in particular, and also other stock exchanges which use colors the traders use wear different colors, colors of blazer or vest, to distinguish what their function is, and this that would play right into Gorski's hand in his interest specifically in color and how it arranges itself in the landscape. So again, this required very high resolution. You've got an awful lot of information going on, and if you're not using a medium that could give you a lot of information, it's just not going to have the same resonance that this has, especially when you're making prints that are easily 10 feet across or more. This is by Karen Apollonia Mueller, another German photographer, who makes landscapes with a very muted palette, and quite often they have small dramas going on in them that at first glance aren't noticeable. In this case, there's actually an SUV on its side, and traffic has come to a halt, and there are a couple of pedestrians who seem to be interested, but it's otherwise kind of treated as business as usual in Los Angeles. Um, I'm very struck by the palette that she keeps so muted. It's unusual in color work. And on the other end of the scale, this is by Edward Burtynsky, who is an environmentalist and an activist, Canadian photographer. And he has lately been working on a very large-scale project on water, and much of it is taken up with the uses and abuses of water. In this case, these are nickel filings, excuse me, nickel tailings, which are debris left over by a processing plant of some sort that uses nickel, and highly toxic and polluting, but with this astonishing red cast to them. Portraiture is more often than not these days done in color, and this image by Joe Pugliese of Pharrell Williams is quite typical. The idea being that in color, we actually find the subject that much more accessible than we do in black and white. Black and white tends to abstract things, and at least I think to many photographers' way of thinking, puts up a barrier between the subject and the viewer. And having said that, of course, he's wearing his hat in such a way that we can't see his eyes. So I don't know how much we're getting to know about him, except that maybe he's a shy guy. This is by Elaine Smithson, who's a Los Angeles-based photographer, and from a series that she has done of young women in their mid to late teens. And she's interested very much in the color of things. I mean, it was a very deliberate decision on her part to place this woman in front of wearing this pink outfit in front of this vibrant green background. But also, she's very interested in gesture and how people present themselves. And even though we see this woman from the back, we have some sense of her character because of the sensitivity that Smithson brings to the process.